Welcome, students, and once again we're going to have or continue in our discussion of an introduction to chemistry, and today we're specifically focusing in on the scientific method. This is probably in any science class you take, whether it's chemistry here, physics, biology, anatomy, physical science. The scientific method is key because it's basically how we do science. And it's basically a reasoning method. We talked about two types of reasoning yesterday, inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. This is basically inductive reasoning and how do you approach science, how we do science as we search for, not the truth. Remember, science is not a search for truth. That's philosophy, or religion, that kind of stuff. Science, we're looking to create a model of how things work. And we want that model to be workable. We want it, to explain the universe around us. And sometimes those models, we come up with an idea and they don't work, or sometimes they partially work and we have to modify it or change it. And all that is part of the scientific method. So what we're going to do is go through the different parts of the scientific method, and different books have different steps. And really they're saying the same thing, just in more or less ways or steps. Some books will summarize the scientific method in like 3 steps or 5 steps. We're going to do it in, I think, about 7 or 8 steps. And that's just so we get the detail down, knowing exactly what's going on as you're going through here. This is something that's super important, and so you will be tested on this. You will need to know the different steps of the scientific method, the definitions of certain terms, and we'll go into some more detail when we get to what we call experimentation, because we will do experiments in chemistry and in labs. So we want to know, well, okay, if we're going to experiment, what are we doing, and what are some of the things that we do in an experiment, and how do we do them, and why do we do them? So let's start with what do we do first? Okay, well, a lot of times you may have heard, observation. Well, why are we observing, or the result of that observation, what does it lead to? Really, the first step of the scientific method is you're going to define a problem or a question. And this is the result of observation. In other words, you've looked at the world around you, or you've seen something, and you're like, wait a minute, why does this do this? And there's always the classic illustration of Isaac Newton, sitting under the tree, and the apple fell on his head, and who knows whether that's actually true or not. But the reality is, the question that he supposedly asked after that is a great example of this. Well, why do apples fall? What causes them to do that? And in his search for that, ultimately led to what we call the law of gravity. And so we want to kind of start with that. You have some sort of problem or some sort of question. Why does things work this way, or why does this happen, or how maybe is another type question. From there, we form a hypothesis. And sometimes you may have heard of a hypothesis defined as an educated guess. I really don't like that answer, because we're not really guessing. It's a scientific idea with no experimental evidence to support it. In other words, it is an idea. It's not like we're randomly just throwing something out there and hoping that maybe it's true. No, this is an idea. There's logic, there's reasoning to it. We've observed what's going on around us. We've observed maybe causes and effects. And so we've come to some sort of conclusion. It's just that there's no experimental evidence to support it yet. There may be in the future, but there's no experimental evidence. And this would be where you begin that forming a hypothesis. This is your first step of forming a model, in essence. You're now creating a model. I think this is why this happens. And here's what I believe. And from there, once you have that model that we talked about earlier, you're going to predict the consequences. Okay, now, if I do this, and we're going to talk about experimentation in a second here. If I do this in my experiment, here's what should happen. If what I believe is true, then here's what should happen. Here's the result. Here's the outcome that should be. And this is super important. And a lot of times and this is why I add these steps to my version, if you want to say, of the scientific method. This is left off in a lot of books. It's this idea of predicting consequences, and I think this is super important because this is what a model needs to do. It needs to predict the consequences, what's going to happen. All right, what happens after that? You experiment. And key thing I want you guys to remember, we're going to talk more about experimentation in a minute here, but when we experiment, we don't experiment just once, but many, many times. There's going to be lots and lots of experiments. In those experiments, we may vary them to see if there's different results, to get a set of data and information. We talked about different types of data, quantitative and qualitative data, and so you'll get this massive data, and from that, you're going to ultimately reach a conclusion. So we're experimenting a lot. Once we have our data, we're going to reason, come back to that idea of reasoning. And we're going to look at our model, and we're going to see, does our model fit what the data tells us? And we predicted this would happen. Did that actually happen? Or were we a little bit off, or were we completely off base? And so, I thought this would happen. I did my experiment. It didn't quite happen. There were some things that happened that I need to explain, or things that I expected to happen that didn't happen at all. Okay, now I need to go back to the drawing board and kind of modify it. Okay, what did I see and observe in my experiment that didn't fit my model? And so now I need to change my model a little bit. And this again, just like experimentation, this may be done multiple times, kind of fine tuning. And this is why we say science is not the search for truth. Because a lot of times what we think is true, we come and we experiment and we realize, it's not really true. This is wrong. And even sometimes we say, oh, well, we elevate something to what we call a theory or a law. And we even find out later on that, no, that's not actually accurate. Because of further experimentation, as technology may develop, or we gain more knowledge in a particular area. Now, if repeated experimentation proves to be true, then the hypothesis can be elevated to a theory. So what is a theory? It's a scientific idea supported by some experimental evidence. So this would be, you get to the point and your model seems to fit your predictions, things are working, it's got some evidence to back it up, and so we elevate it to a theory. Now here you have to be careful, because there's some things that are called theories that really actually aren't. For example, we talk about the theory of evolution. Evolution is not a theory. It doesn't fit. It hasn't got, number one, nobody's observed it. Okay, so that's a problem right there. It has to be observable. Two, it has to be testable. You can't test evolution or experiment with it. So it really, when you run into those problems, I can't take something in a lab and try to do evolution, especially considering that it takes, billions of years to ultimately happen. So, there's no way that we can test something like that. So, if you want to say it's a scientific idea, okay. It's a hypothesis. Here's what we think. Fair enough. Now the flip side to that is you also can't say that creation is a theory either. Because again, creation is a one-time event. It's not observable. It's not testable either. So that's why we would say that those, really, both of them are more philosophy or religion. And so we want to make sure that we understand that their worldviews is really what they are. All right, if you continue to, again, you never stop experimenting, so it gets to be a theory. You continue to experiment, and you have a lot of experiments, and it seems to hold true, then it can be elevated to a law, which is simply a scientific idea supported by a great deal of experimental evidence. Now, it is possible for something to be elevated to a law, and we say this is the law of whatever, and we find out later, maybe 100 years go by, and because of new knowledge or new technology that we have and abilities to test or experiment with something, we find out, oh, wait a minute, what we once thought about this, maybe most of it is true, but there are some exceptions to it, and so it's not, a universal law, or maybe it's not true in these situations. And so a law can be actually proven to be wrong. It is not scientific fact just because it is a law. It can be proven to be incorrect. Now, usually once it gets there, there is a lot of evidence. You can't ignore the evidence that has proven it to be true. All right, let's talk a little bit about experimentation. First of all, what is an experiment? It's simply a way to observe a natural process under controlled conditions. That's basically what we're doing. Is we're taking what is a natural process. Occasionally, it may be an unnatural process, something that doesn't normally. We'll talk a little bit about the periodic table. There's some elements there that are not natural that we've forced, or basically man-made elements. There's some that don't normally bond that we've forced to bond in unnatural conditions. But the majority of experiments are done. They're natural processes, and we want to control. Why do we want to control? To be able to see what will happen in this situation. Does this hold true in this environment? So how do we do that? Well, we use what are called variables, which are factors that change in an experiment. And there's two types of variables, and you will want to know those because occasionally in labs we will talk about these. The first variable is what we call the independent variable. And this is the variable that the scientist changes. And you'll notice it's singular because usually when you're changing a variable, you only want to change one thing. So this might be, we'll have some labs where we're going to use the same elements or compounds, and we may see how they react with water in one instance, and then we'll put this same exact element in, let's say, an acid and see how it reacts there. Well, what's the independent variable? The independent variable is the solution that we're putting it in. Everything else remains the same. The amount we're putting in, the substance we're using, the environment of the class. We're not changing the environment of the classroom or the heat or anything else. The only thing we're changing is the solution that we're using. And it's very important that you only change one thing at a time, because if you change 10 things, 10 variables, then it's really difficult, or it's basically impossible to tell, well, which one caused the change, if there was a change. And so we only want to have one independent variable. The other variables are called dependent variables. And these may be things that do change, but they're not things that you changed. So it could be, if we go back to our example here, I put my element in water and nothing happens. Now I change that variable and I put it in acid and I get some bubbles and some gas that's released as a result of that. Well, okay, so there's something else changed other than the solution, but was it something I changed? No, it was a result of the independent variable. Something happened as a result. There was a chemical reaction that went on. It could be, the color may change as well. And so those are things that I observe and I know, well, okay, when I change this independent variable, what dependent variables change and how did they change? And that leads me to some conclusions as a result of that. Okay, an experimental group is simply a group of samples that's exposed to that variable, and the variable we're talking about here is the independent variable. So you may have a set. So if you have a set of test tubes, here's all these, and I'm doing the same thing to them. I'm adding this new solution or whatever it might be. The control group is a group of samples that is not exposed to the variable. So you can kind of compare. In a sense, you can compare. Here's my experimental group. Here's my control group. Here's what it looked like originally. So how did they change over time? Okay, so that's, in essence, a little bit about experimentation and what we will be doing and using. All right, just something as we conclude here. To understand, and I didn't really have a particular category to put this in under, but just understand as we do science, there's a couple different types of science. One is applied science, and it explores natural processes and products for specific applications. In other words, you're actually looking, you're looking for a cure for cancer. And so we're looking for, okay, what causes cancer? What is cancer? What can we use to attack it or whatever? So there's a specific application, or maybe it's to make well water pure. There's a specific application to it. The other type is what we call pure science. And pure science is just, we're studying the world around us, the universe around us, to figure out and learn new things, and as we look a little further out in the universe and we see a new star, a new planet or whatever, or we find something new about the cell, this is just, we're learning new things. It's not that it may eventually end up for a specific application, but not immediately. So those are the two types of science. And I believe that's it today.